Today I'm sewing a sleeve with a laced cuff, and I would like to invite you to sew along with me. Although I'm doing a lace cuff today, a buttoned cuff is nearly the same with just a couple of small changes, and so this tutorial should do for both. Whether you're doing a laced or a buttoned cuff, the single most important thing is that you need to have at least 2 layers of fabric. The second layer provides both mechanical and structural support to the lacing, and it helps it to look finished if someone, for example, rolls their cuffs up during the day. You can get 2 layers in several different ways: by adding a lining behind all or part of the sleeve, or by even adding an extra layer on the outside. It's still 2 layers deep. Or you can do a more modern cuff where it is made as a separate 2-piece cuff that is sewn onto the sleeve. It works, like I said, because you get mechanical support from the extra fabric, especially if you get into the seam allowances. This gives you several layers of thickness, and if that isn't enough, you can add interlining or interfacing. Interlining is simply another layer of fabric sandwiched between the others. It will never show, but it does provide extra support, and interfacing is a modern product that does largely the same thing, except that it comes in a fusible, iron-on version or a sew-on. A lot of beginners find iron-on easier. Always iron it to the lining, the inside, not the outside. Then, as I mentioned, this will help it look finished if someone rolls up your cuff. And perhaps most importantly, we're going to use the seam as the opening for this cuff, which is much simpler than most modern patterns. And it's very, very common in medieval times not to move the cuff, but actually to move the underarm seam to the location where you want your cuff. So if you want your cuff on the back of the arm, you move the sleeve. Now, one difference: if you are designing for buttons, you need to add extra fabric to the lower arm, to the sleeve, at the level where you plan to have buttons. You can add it to both sides or to the underside. This is an aesthetic decision, and you don't need to add very much. In modern sewing, we add extensive button plackets that are quite wide, but what we have surviving from medieval times suggests that that is not always the case. The examples that we have suggest buttons that were sewn extremely close to the edge, definitely using the seam allowance for extra structure, and sometimes right on the edge, and sometimes even with cording or braiding behind them for super support. And we have suggestions that buttonholes were similarly very, very close to the edge, and in many cases very close together. When you lay out your eyelets or your buttonholes, spacing is an aesthetic decision. Sleeves are not under a lot of mechanical force. I'm going to do spiral lacing today, and this is the pattern I'm going to use, but buttons were simply spaced evenly on sleeves, and again, fairly close together. Now, the order of construction is terribly important. You want to sew this so that you aren't fighting the tiny tube of the sleeve, or heaven forbid, the entire garment in order to sew these. So first you're going to sew the cuff layers to themselves. You're going to clip, stabilize, turn, and iron that. Then you're going to sew as many eyelets or buttonholes as you can while it's still detached from everything else. Now you're going to make the sleeve into a tube, add the cuff or the lining, do all of your finishing work on that sleeve tube, and then when you're done, you will have a complete sleeve, and you will proceed to add that to the body. So if you're ready, I invite you to sew along with me step by step, and I'll show you some extra tips and tricks as we go. The first step when you're sewing any cuff is to line up the layers, the outer and the inner fabric that you're going to use. And I'm going to apologize here. By the time it occurred to me that this would be a good YouTube video, I'd already done this step. So I'm just going to talk you through it and show you what I've already done. You line these up with the inside layer, in this case my white linen lining, sticking out a tiny bit to the left and the right sides. If you're using interfacing or interlining, you're going to add it to the stack before you sew it on the side of the lining, on the inside part of it. If you are adding a lining that goes only part way up the sleeve, I want you to take that top free edge and fold it under, so fold it to the wrong side, so that later on you will be able to finish this up and sew it nicely. Use pins to note where you need to start and stop sewing, and stop exactly on the pins. Fold the cuff in half, pair the cuffs up with each other, make sure that all of those pins are in exactly the same location relative to the edge of the sleeve, and then just sew them. Backstitch the beginning and the end of every stitch line as always, And then also backstitch a little bit extra on those corners in order to reinforce them, because in the next step, you're going to be clipping that seam allowance. In this case, I'm working with two fabrics that like to unravel, a brocade and a linen, and so I can't clip the corners as aggressively as I might like. I want this to be sturdy and structural and to survive many, many, many washes and wears. That means I'm leaving a little more fabric behind. It means that it's going to be a little bit lumpy, and I'm okay with that. Once you clip your corners, grab your sewing machine and stabilize the raw edges by running a quick zigzag stitch over them. Now turn it right side out and very, very carefully, working your way down the edge an inch or two at a time, roll it so that the outer layer sticks out a tiny bit past the inner layer and the seam is completely open. The corners are as flat as humanly possible, and iron the crap out of it. Iron, iron, iron. Do remember wool and silk if you're working on the front side and not the back. Always use a pressing cloth. Do remember that steam is your friend with most of the natural fibers. It's time to mark the location for either your eyelets or your buttonholes. Take your time, make sure that everything lines up, make sure that your spacing is even. I like to do this with pins first. Pins are easy to move. Then I come back with a little bit of chalk and I draw literally on top of the pins. I am going to sew my eyelets and buttonholes with a machine. I have a machine that does these, it does a great job, and I'm comfortable with that. You can also hand sew them, which will be more historical and authentic, and I will link tutorials for that in the comments below that other people have already prepared. At this point, our paths diverge. Because I'm making a terribly complex sleeve here that uses both methods, I can show you both on the same construction. I'm going to start with this lower cuff, which acts just like a lining underneath a sleeve. I'm going to start by pinning and sewing the right sides of the outer garment fabric together. And when I stitch this, I'm going to get as close as humanly possible to my previous stitch line where I built the cuff. Then I am going to stabilize the seam allowances and iron that seam. I'm going to do some creative calisthenics to get this thing sort of half inside out so that I can do the same thing on the lining. I'm going to sew that as close as I possibly can. And then there's going to be this little teeny tiny gap where I couldn't quite stitch all the way to the other stitches, and I will finish that by hand with a quick little whip stitch. The next step is one I'm not taking on this particular sleeve. If you've done a normal sleeve lining, at this point you're going to have a flappy top edge. You've already ironed it over, thank goodness, while it was easy to work with. You're going to take that and you're going to stitch it to the sleeve body. So I'm showing you here where I've done this on a previous garment. You would normally be done. Back to today's terribly complicated sleeve though, now I am also going to be attaching this entire construction as though it were a cuff. With one difference. Normally, a modern cuff is going to have buttons right up until the edge, and you need to hem a little bit of the sleeve seam allowance just above the cuff to make the little split so that it can open up when you stuff your hand through it. You'll notice that my sleeve is substantially larger than my cuff, so it has to be gathered or pleated to fit. Very, very common with a two-part cuff construction. And I've got it pleated. Again, line these up, make sure the pleats are symmetrical, the left arm looks like the right arm, pin everything together, only the outer cuff layer to the sleeve. Only one layer, sew this, edge to edge. Take that, iron it so that the seam allowance faces towards the cuff, get it nice and flat and smooth, and then with the sleeve inside out, I want you to iron the inner fabric, the lining fabric, so that it folds over neatly on the top. And as a tiny trick here, because I plan to machine sew this, I am ironing so that it sticks out a little bit past and above the existing stitch line for the top layer of fabric. I'm going to machine stitch this from the top. It's called stitch in the ditch. You're going to pull apart the sides of the fabric from the top so that you can get your needle exactly in the existing ditch of the stitch line, and you're going to sew that bad boy together. It is going to capture the lower lining fabric because I've ironed and pinned it to stick out and allow this to do that. And if there is any small gaps where your stitching doesn't meet your other, sew it up by hand. And now we're to finishing details. I'm going to cut open my eyelets or my buttonholes. You can do this very, very carefully with a seam ripper. You can do it with a leather hole punch for eyelets, and you can do it with a buttonhole punch or, in a pinch, a chisel for buttonholes. And I generally do lacing and buttons at the end when we do the final fitting, in case I need to adjust the position of the buttons a little bit to make the lower sleeve a tiny bit looser or a tiny bit tighter. At this point, you are done. Congratulations on having made a complete laced or buttoned cuff. Many people consider this to be an intermediate level skill, so you can give yourself a big pat on the back and enjoy your new garment. I really want you to be successful in your costuming journey, so if there's a topic that you would like me to cover, please let me know in the comments below, and I'll see what I can do to make it happen. Until then, enjoy your sewing adventures, and thank you for staying to the end of this video.